200 years ago, the Skarn Ascendancy erased humanity from every star chart in known space. Not conquered, not destroyed, erased. Every record of Earth's location deleted. Every trade route that once led to Sol redrawn to lead nowhere. Every mention of humanity in 1,000 archives across 1,000 worlds, quietly, methodically removed. The Skarn called it Directive Silence, the most ambitious act of historical erasure any empire had ever attempted. They believed it worked. They were wrong. The Skarn Ascendancy ruled through information as much as through fleets. 12,000 worlds, 400 archive networks, and a doctrine that had never changed in 6,000 years of expansion. An enemy that cannot be found cannot be helped. When the Skarn High Council decided humanity posed an unacceptable long-term threat, not through strength, but through the sheer speed of its technological growth, they did not send a fleet to destroy Earth. They sent an archivist instead. Archivist Prime Sarenth Vale had spent 300 years perfecting the art of historical deletion. He did not believe in war when erasure would suffice. A dead enemy is remembered as a martyr, he told the council. A forgotten enemy is remembered as nothing at all. The council approved his plan unanimously. Humanity would not be conquered. Humanity would simply cease to exist in the records of every civilization capable of finding them. Vale considered it his finest work. The operation took 4 years to complete. Skarn agents, embedded across 100 archive networks, systematically removed every trace of Sol's coordinates from Ascendancy records, allied databases, and the thousands of independent trade registries that stretched across known space. Star charts were redrawn, historical texts were edited, diplomatic records referencing early human contact were quietly reclassified as fabrications, then deleted entirely. Where Sol's system had once been marked on 1,000 different navigation charts, only empty space remained, a small, unremarkable gap between two better-known star clusters, exactly the kind of gap that drew no attention at all. Vale did not stop at coordinates, he erased context. Every mention of first contact with humanity, every recorded encounter, every trade agreement or skirmish or diplomatic exchange, all of it was systematically scrubbed from 100 different archive systems, replaced with subtly altered records that left no obvious gap for a careful reader to notice. Species that had once traded with human colonies found their own records now showing decades of uneventful, humanity-free history. Diplomats who had personally met human representatives found their own memories, over the years, growing strangely uncertain about details that should have been vivid. The Skarn had not merely hidden a location, they had rewritten the shape of galactic memory itself. 4 years after Directive Silence began, Vale presented the Council with his final report. Humanity no longer exists, he said, in any record accessible to any civilization in known space. Whatever remains of them, wherever they remain, no one will ever find them again. And more importantly, no one will ever think to look. The Council declared the operation an unqualified success. They did not send a follow-up fleet to confirm humanity's fate. They did not need to. In the Skarn Ascendancy's 6,000-year history, no erased civilization had ever resurfaced. Vale filed the operation as closed. 200 years passed in silence. What Vale's report did not mention, because he had no way of knowing it, was that his agents had not worked entirely unnoticed. In the final year of the erasure operation, a Skarn courier vessel assigned to the project's outer perimeter had drifted, briefly and without authorization, into the edge of human-monitored space, close enough for human long-range sensors to catch a fragment of encrypted Skarn communication traffic before the courier corrected course and withdrew. Human cryptographers spent the better part of a decade decoding that fragment. What they found confirmed, with chilling clarity, exactly what the Skarn Ascendancy believed it had already accomplished. Vale, satisfied with a job he considered flawlessly executed, ordered one final confirmation sweep before formally closing the operation. A single reconnaissance drone, dispatched quietly to the edge of Saul's original coordinates, tasked only with confirming that no active signal traffic remained detectable from the system. The drone found nothing: no transmissions, no fleet activity, no trace of the industrious, technologically ambitious species Skarn scouts had once catalogued decades earlier. What the drone could not detect, because it had never been designed to look for it, was the deliberate, carefully engineered silence humanity had already begun constructing around its own system, independent of anything the Skarn had done, built specifically to reinforce whatever erasure the Ascendancy's own operation might eventually achieve. Vale's drone transmitted its final report and departed. It would be the last Skarn vessel to approach Saul's true coordinates for nearly 2 centuries. Humanity, watching that departure from carefully hidden sensor arrays of their own, understood in that moment exactly what kind of opportunity had just been handed to them by an empire too confident in its own historical authority to imagine any other outcome. They did not celebrate, they began planning. Phase 1 complete. 2 centuries is a long time for an empire to grow comfortable in its own certainty. By the time Grand Archivist Kessa Thorne inherited Vale's old position, Directive Silence had become little more than a historical footnote, a minor, half-remembered success buried deep in the Ascendancy's archive of completed operations. Thorne herself had never studied the details closely. She knew only the broad strokes: a minor species, erased 200 years earlier, of no further relevance to Ascendancy policy. She had far more pressing concerns. The Ascendancy's expansion into the Varen Reach had stalled for 3 years, blocked by a stubborn coalition of minor powers that refused to yield territory without a fight. The Varen Reach campaign had consumed the majority of Thorne's professional attention for the better part of 2 years, a grinding, unglamorous conflict fought largely through economic pressure and limited skirmishes, rather than the decisive fleet engagements that shaped the Ascendancy's more celebrated historical conquests. The coalition opposing Ascendancy expansion into the Reach, a loose alliance of 7 minor powers with little in common, beyond a shared unwillingness to be absorbed into a larger empire, had proven far more resilient than Ascendancy strategists initially anticipated, drawing out a campaign originally projected to conclude within a single year into a prolonged, resource-draining stalemate. It was, by every measure that mattered to the current generation of Ascendancy leadership, a far more urgent concern than any 200-year-old historical footnote buried in the archive's least examined corners. "We need new resources," she told the War Council, "and the Varen Reach Coalition is not going to yield through diplomacy alone." The Council debated for weeks. Fleet deployments were expensive. Prolonged sieges drained resources the Ascendancy could ill afford to waste on a region of only modest strategic value. It was during one such debate, deep in the Ascendancy's archive networks, that a junior data analyst named Perrin Oss made a discovery that would have been dismissed instantly 200 years earlier, but now, in an era of comfortable certainty, went almost unnoticed for weeks. A trade ship, registered to an unlisted point of origin, had docked at a minor Ascendancy way station 3 systems from the Varen Reach. Oss flagged it as a minor anomaly. An unregistered vessel was hardly unheard of among independent traders operating at the edges of Ascendancy space. What caught his attention was the ship's cargo manifest, filed in a language his translation systems could not fully parse. Not an unknown alien script. Something stranger, a heavily modified variant of a trade dialect his systems recognized only in fragments, as though it had evolved independently from a common root centuries out of contact with the wider galaxy. He filed a routine report and moved on to more pressing matters. The report sat unread for 6 weeks. When it finally reached a mid-level Ascendancy intelligence officer named Dresh Kale, the anomaly caught his attention for a very different reason. Kale had a passing academic interest in obscure historical linguistics, a hobby, not a professional focus, but one that had, over the years, given him a broader familiarity with archived trade dialects than most of his colleagues possessed. The fragments in the manifest reminded him of something, a pattern he could not immediately place, buried somewhere in half-forgotten training material from early in his career. It took him 3 days of searching through poorly indexed historical archives to find the match. The dialect fragments matched, with unsettling precision, a set of linguistic samples cross-referenced in a training document from over 200 years earlier, a document that itself referenced a species designation Kale had never encountered anywhere else in his career. Species human, status, classified Directive Silence. The classification tag alone told him almost nothing. Directive Silence had no further accessible records, no explanation, no context beyond the tag itself, and a redacted operational summary that had clearly been edited to remove nearly every substantive detail. Kale, more curious than concerned, escalated the discovery to his superiors, expecting the matter to be resolved quickly, quietly, the way most minor archive anomalies eventually were. It was not resolved quickly. It reached Grand Archivist Thorne's desk within the week, and for the first time in her career, she found herself staring at a classification tag that predated her own service by nearly a full century, referencing an operation so thoroughly buried that even her considerable archive access could not immediately explain what it had actually accomplished. She ordered a full review. What she found troubled her more than she initially admitted to her staff. Directive Silence had erased not just a location, but an entire species presence from galactic memory, an operation of a scale and ambition that, as far as she could determine, had never been attempted before or since in Ascendancy history. And now, 200 years later, a ship carrying that species' language had appeared in Ascendancy-controlled space, entirely unaware or entirely unconcerned that it should not exist at all. Thorne's first instinct was dismissal. Whatever remained of this erased species after 2 centuries, it could not possibly pose any meaningful threat. A single trade ship, however strange its origins, was hardly evidence of a resurgent civilization. "Track it," she told her staff, quietly. "I want to know where it came from before we decide whether this matters." Her staff obeyed, expecting a routine, low-priority surveillance assignment that would likely conclude within weeks, with nothing more than a curious historical footnote to add to the archive. They did not expect what they would eventually find. Perrin Oss, the junior analyst whose original flagged report had started the entire chain of discovery, had by then moved on to other assignments, unaware his brief note about an unregistered trade ship had traveled so far up the Ascendancy's chain of command. He learned of its significance only weeks later, when Grand Archivist Thorne's office requested his original data files directly, along with every fragment of raw sensor telemetry his systems had logged from the encounter. "I thought it was a smuggler," he told his supervisor, half convinced he was about to be reprimanded for wasting senior staff time on a trivial anomaly. "I had no idea what it actually was." Dresh Kale's initial 3 days of research, which he had conducted largely out of personal curiosity during off-duty hours, expanded rapidly once his findings reached Thorne's desk. He was reassigned within a week to a small, newly formed task force dedicated entirely to reconstructing whatever remained of Directive Silence's original operational records. A task complicated significantly by how thoroughly Vale's own agents had scrubbed the Ascendancy's own archives of any detailed account of what the operation had actually targeted. Whoever ran this operation, Cale told his new team during their first briefing, didn't just erase the target. They erased their own paper trail almost as thoroughly. We are reconstructing this from fragments other departments never bothered to clean up, because no one ever thought to look for them. The task force's early findings painted a portrait of an operation far more ambitious than anyone in the modern Ascendancy archive system had previously understood. Cross-referencing shipping manifests, diplomatic correspondence, and fragments of technical records that had survived only because they had been misfiled under unrelated headings, Cale's team slowly reconstructed the outline of a species erased so thoroughly that even confirming its original name took the team nearly 2 weeks. Human Homeworld, Sol 3, status, Directive Silence phase complete. The final entry, dated 200 years earlier, offered no further detail beyond a single closing note that would later strike every member of Cale's team as unnervingly understated, given everything that followed. No further monitoring deemed necessary. Phase 2 complete. The trade ship's trail proved far harder to follow than anyone on Thorne's staff anticipated. It had docked, conducted a brief, entirely unremarkable trade exchange, and departed on a heading that led toward a region of space the Ascendancy's own star charts marked as empty. The same small, unremarkable gap between two better-known clusters that Vale's operation had created 200 years earlier. Ascendancy sensor drones, dispatched quietly to track the ship's trajectory, lost the signal entirely once it crossed into that gap. Not because the ship outran them. Because, according to every sensor reading Thorne's staff could gather, the ship simply stopped registering as a coherent target the moment it entered that region of space. The same way Vale's erased records had once made an entire star system disappear from galactic memory. Thorne authorized a second, more thorough surveillance operation, this time using a small stealth vessel rather than automated drones, hoping a crewed ship with better sensor discretion might succeed where the drones had failed. The stealth vessel's captain, a cautious veteran named Ilvana Kor, approached the gap with the same wariness she would have applied to any unexplored, unmapped region of space protocol that would prove, in the end, entirely justified. Her ship's sensors registered the anomaly the moment they crossed the boundary of the mapped gap. Space itself seemed to resist accurate measurement in a way her instruments had never previously encountered. Distances subtly miscalculated, star positions shifting by degrees too small to notice individually, but too consistent to be sensor error. Kor filed her observations carefully, methodically, understanding intuitively that she was documenting something far outside her normal operational experience. The region does not appear naturally anomalous, she reported. The distortion pattern is too consistent, too deliberate. This is not a natural phenomenon. Something engineered this. She pushed deeper into the gap, her caution warring with a professional curiosity that had served her well across a long career of exactly this kind of careful, deliberate reconnaissance. 3 days into the gap, her sensors finally registered something her instruments had not been able to detect from the outside. A star system, small and unremarkable by any conventional measure, hidden behind layers of engineered distortion so thorough that no casual observer would ever suspect it existed at all. The system had one sun, 3 habitable planets, and according to Kor's increasingly startled sensor readings, a population far larger than any 200-year-old erased colony should reasonably possess. She did not approach directly. Instead, she held her position at the edge of detection range, recording everything her instruments could gather from a cautious distance, understanding that whatever she had found, it was far beyond her authority to engage with directly. What she recorded, over the following 6 hours, would become some of the most closely guarded intelligence data in Ascendancy history. Orbital shipyards, dozens of them, positioned in careful formation around the system's outer planets. Fleet formations, disciplined and precise, running drills that suggested decades, perhaps centuries of continuous military development. Infrastructure that, by every visible metric her sensors could measure, matched or exceeded the most advanced Ascendancy technology she had ever personally encountered. This was not a struggling, isolated remnant of an erased species clinging to survival. This was a civilization that had spent 200 years, hidden entirely from galactic view, building something the Ascendancy had never once anticipated needing to prepare for. Core transmitted her findings back to Thorn, with a single line summarizing 200 years of buried Ascendancy assumptions unraveling in real time. Directive Silence did not destroy them. It gave them 2 centuries to build in absolute secrecy, unbothered by any outside interference. Recommend immediate escalation to full War Council review. Thorn read the report in her private office, alone, for nearly an hour before she finally understood the full weight of what her predecessor's finest operation had actually accomplished. Vale had not erased a threat. He had accidentally created the perfect conditions for one. Core remained at the edge of detection range for a further 2 days, resisting the professional urge to push closer, understanding that whatever she had found demanded caution far beyond her own authority to exercise judgment on. Her extended observation yielded additional details that only deepened the unease already spreading through Thorn's small circle of aware officers. The fleet formations she observed were not merely large. They demonstrated a level of tactical discipline and coordinated maneuver that, in her professional assessment, exceeded anything she had personally witnessed in 20 years of Ascendancy fleet service. These are not raw numbers alone, she noted in her final report before withdrawing. This is a military force that has trained together extensively for a very long time. I do not believe what I am observing represents a civilization caught unprepared. Her withdrawal from the system's edge proved more difficult than her approach. Twice during her retreat, her sensors registered brief, unexplained proximity alerts, readings suggesting something had passed close to her vessel without ever fully resolving into an identifiable contact. She logged both incidents carefully, noting in her report a conclusion that unsettled Thorn more than almost anything else in the entire dossier. I do not believe I was undetected during my approach, Core wrote. I believe I was permitted to observe exactly as much as they wished me to see, and no more. Thorn read that final line 3 times before setting the report aside, understanding with growing unease that whatever civilization Core had discovered, it had not merely survived 2 centuries of isolation. It had done so with enough sophistication to manage, deliberately, the terms of its own rediscovery. She convened a small, tightly restricted planning session with her most trusted senior staff, deliberately excluding the broader War Council until she could determine how to present findings this consequential without triggering the kind of reflexive, poorly considered response she feared her colleagues might default to. We are not looking at a wounded survivor, she told her staff. We are looking at something that has had 200 years to become whatever it wanted to become, entirely on its own terms. I do not know yet what that means for us, but I do not believe caution has ever mattered more than it does right now. Phase 3 complete. What Core's reconnaissance could never have fully captured, because no outside observer had ever been permitted close enough to understand it, was the deliberate, generational plan humanity had built in the 2 centuries since Directive Silence severed them from the wider galaxy. The erasure itself had been discovered by human intelligence analysts within the first decade, long before the Skarn Ascendancy ever suspected their operation had been noticed at all. Coalition cryptographers, monitoring residual Skarn communication traffic near the edge of human territory, had intercepted fragments of Vale's original operational orders, enough to understand, with growing alarm, exactly what was being done to their own historical presence in galactic records. Humanity's leadership, faced with the unprecedented reality of an empire attempting to erase their entire civilization from galactic memory, made a decision that would define the next 2 centuries of human strategy. They did not attempt to reverse the erasure. They did not send diplomatic protests to an ascendancy that had already demonstrated its willingness to simply delete inconvenient truths from its own records. Instead, they let it happen, and then they built around it. The strategic logic, laid out in a foundational planning document later declassified as the Sorinth Directive, named, with deliberate irony, after the very archivist who had ordered humanity's erasure, was simple and unflinching. If the galaxy believes we no longer exist, we will use that belief as the greatest strategic asset any civilization has ever possessed. 200 years of uninterrupted, unobserved development, no diplomatic obligations, no trade restrictions, no wary neighbors watching our every fleet movement. We will build in silence, exactly as long as their erasure allows us to. Humanity's leadership committed to the plan with a discipline that would have seemed, to any outside observer, almost impossibly patient. Every human colony beyond the immediate Sol system was gradually consolidated, over decades, into a carefully hidden network of settlements distributed across the same engineered distortion field that had swallowed Core's sensor readings. Technology, developed specifically to reinforce and expand upon the very erasure the Skarn Ascendancy had inadvertently gifted them. Human scientists, freed from the pressure of external competition or observation, pursued research programs across multiple generations, without the usual constraints of rival powers monitoring their progress or attempting to steal their advances. The results, compounded across 2 centuries of uninterrupted development, exceeded even the most optimistic projections of the plan's original architects. Fleet technology that would have taken any observed, actively competing civilization far longer to develop, given the absence of any external pressure forcing premature deployment of unfinished systems, advanced instead at a pace dictated purely by internal readiness rather than external threat. Humanity did not need to rush a single breakthrough into service before it was fully refined. They had 200 years, and no one watching to notice how they spent it. Dr. Amara Voss, a historian working within the Coalition's small internal archive division, would later write the definitive account of this period, an account she was permitted to complete only decades after most of its details had already ceased to be operationally sensitive. "We were given the rarest gift any civilization can receive," she wrote. 2 centuries of complete privacy, granted to us by an enemy who believed silence was the same as non-existence. We spent every year of it exactly as we intended to. The plan's final phase, laid out from its earliest drafting, always anticipated this exact moment. The moment some outside observer, by accident or persistence, would eventually rediscover humanity's hidden presence. Human intelligence agencies had monitored Ascendancy archive networks continuously throughout the 2 centuries of isolation, tracking exactly the kind of anomalous discovery T. Perrin Oss's initial report and Dresh Kale's subsequent research had eventually triggered. By the time Ilvana Core's stealth vessel crossed into the edge of the distortion field, Human Command had already known, for nearly 3 weeks, that discovery was imminent. They had been preparing for this exact scenario for longer than most of their current fleet officers had been alive. The architect of the Sorinth Directive's earliest drafts, a strategist named Admiral Nira Akafer, had died nearly a century before Kor's stealth vessel ever crossed into the distortion field. But her original planning documents remain the foundational framework every subsequent generation of human leadership continued to refine. Okafor's core insight, radical in its patience, had shaped every major human policy decision for 2 centuries afterward. An erased civilization has only one truly irreplaceable resource, and that resource is time uninterrupted by outside interference. Every other advantage can eventually be matched, she wrote, in a passage later quoted in coalition military academies for generations. Time spent unobserved cannot be recovered by any rival once it has passed. We must spend hours as though we will never be given a second chance to do so. Successive generations of human leadership inherited Okafor's framework and adapted it as circumstances demanded, but never abandoned its central premise. Fleet development proceeded methodically, generation by generation, each new class of vessel building deliberately upon proven prior designs rather than rushing untested innovations into service under external pressure. Human shipyards, hidden deep within the engineered distortion field, produced warships across 2 centuries without the constant compromises that competing, actively observed civilizations were forced to accept. Vessels rushed into production before full testing, weapons deployed before their flaws were fully understood, doctrine shaped by the panic of active conflict rather than the patience of careful preparation. By the time Kor's sensors finally registered the scale of what humanity had built, the resulting fleet reflected 200 years of uninterrupted refinement that no actively contested development program, anywhere else in known space, could realistically have matched. Behind the fleet's technical achievement stood generations of ordinary human families who had lived their entire lives within the boundaries of the hidden colonies, most of them never knowing any other way of life, raised from birth to understand the isolation not as deprivation, but as purpose. The Marsh family, whose members had served in the human shipyards across 5 consecutive generations since the earliest days of the Sarinth Directive, offered a portrait doctor. Voss's later historical work would return to repeatedly as representative of the broader human experience during isolation. Elias Marsh, the family's founding patriarch, had been among the original engineers who fled to the hidden colonies in the years immediately following the discovery of Directive Silence, leaving behind an outer Sol settlement that would later be dismantled entirely as part of the broader consolidation effort. His granddaughter, Priya Marsh, born decades later within the fully established hidden colonies, grew up knowing only the discipline and purpose of a civilization building quietly toward a future she was taught to understand as inevitable, even if its precise timing remained uncertain. "We were never told we were hiding out of fear," she recalled in an interview conducted years after the Sol Boundary Accord, part of a broader oral history project documenting the isolation period. "We were told we were building something worth waiting for." That distinction mattered enormously to how an entire generation of us understood our own lives. Her own children, born in the decades immediately preceding Kor's eventual discovery, represented the 5th consecutive generation of Marsh family members to work within the same shipyards their ancestor had helped establish 2 centuries earlier. A continuity of purpose that human planners had always understood was as essential to the Sarinth Directive's ultimate success as any single technological breakthrough. Human intelligence services, meanwhile, maintained continuous, careful monitoring of Skarn archive networks throughout the entire period of isolation, understanding from the earliest days of the Sarinth Directive that discovery, whenever it eventually came, needed to be met with readiness rather than panic. Every anomaly in Ascendancy archive access patterns, every unusual query touching anywhere near Directive Silence's original operational records, was tracked and analyzed by a small, dedicated division within human command structure that existed for no other purpose across its entire two-century history. When Perrin Os's initial report first flagged the anomalous trade ship, Huma, monitoring systems detected the associated archive activity within days, long before Kale's own research had progressed far enough to fully understand what he had found. Fleet Admiral Idris Chen, commanding humanity's assembled defense force at the time of Kor's discovery, had spent the better part of his career preparing specifically for this moment, having risen through a command structure that treated the eventual end of isolation not as a possibility, but as an operational certainty requiring constant readiness. "We do not know which day Discovery arrives," he told his assembled fleet officers in a briefing recorded weeks before Kor's stealth vessel ever crossed into the distortion field. "We only know that when it does, our response in that first encounter will define how the rest of the galaxy understands us for a generation or more. We will not waste 200 years of patience on a single moment of poor judgment." Chen's fleet, positioned in careful, rehearsed formation throughout the distortion field's interior, had run the exact scenario that would eventually unfold: an armed ascendancy force crossing into human territory, dozens of times in simulation, refining response protocols until the eventual real encounter proceeded almost exactly as decades of preparation had anticipated it would. Nothing about humanity's response to the Skarn fleet's arrival was improvised. Every element, from the precise timing of the decloaking maneuver to the calm, measured tone of the warning transmission, had been rehearsed and refined across years of deliberate planning, waiting only for the moment it would finally be needed. Phase 4 complete. Grand Archivist Thorne brought Kor's findings before the full War Council within days of receiving them, understanding intuitively that whatever this discovery represented, it was far beyond her own authority to manage quietly. The Council's initial reaction mirrored her own, a mixture of disbelief and mounting alarm, as officer after officer struggled to reconcile the scale of Kor's reported findings with 2 centuries of comfortable ascendancy assumption that Directive Silence had ended humanity as any kind of meaningful factor in galactic affairs. "This cannot be accurate," argued Fleet Marshal Perrin Os, no relation to the junior analyst whose report had begun the entire discovery chain. "A civilization does not simply develop this level of technology in isolation, unobserved, without any external assistance." Kor's own testimony, delivered in person before the Council, left little room for such doubt. "I have transmitted full sensor telemetry," she told the assembled Council. "Every reading has been independently verified by 3 separate analysis teams. This is not speculation. This is confirmed, observed fact." The Council debated for nearly 2 full days before reaching a decision that would prove, in retrospect, to be the single most consequential misjudgment in Ascendancy military history. Rather than approach the newly discovered human civilization through diplomatic channels, an option several Council members raised, given the extraordinary uncertainty surrounding a 200-year-old erased species of unknown current capability, the Council instead authorized a show of force. "A civilization that has spent 2 centuries hiding," argued Fleet Marshal Os, "responds to strength, not negotiation. We demonstrate our capability, and they will understand precisely how limited their own options remain." The fleet dispatched to the edge of the distortion field numbered 800 warships, not the Ascendancy's full military strength, but a force calculated to be overwhelming against any civilization that had spent 2 centuries developing in isolation, without access to the kind of large-scale fleet engagements that shaped modern Ascendancy military doctrine. Fleet Marshal Os himself led the deployment, confident that whatever humanity had built in secret, it could not possibly account for genuine combat experience against a peer military power. "They have built ships," he told his officers as the fleet approached the distortion field's edge. They have not fought a war in 200 years. There is a difference between preparation and readiness, and we are about to teach them exactly what that difference costs. The Ascendancy fleet crossed into the distortion field's boundary at 600 hours, expecting the same sensor degradation Corps' stealth vessel had reported during her initial reconnaissance. The days leading up to the crossing had been consumed by careful, methodical preparation aboard Oss's flagship, his officers running repeated simulations against every fragment of data Corps' reconnaissance had provided, confident that 800 warships represented more than sufficient force against any civilization, still finding its footing after 2 centuries of isolation. They have had time, Oss told his assembled command staff the night. GHT before the crossing, but time alone does not create combat experience. We have fought real wars. We have tested our doctrine against real enemies. Whatever they have built in isolation remains, by definition, untested. His confidence, shared by most of his senior officers, reflected an assumption embedded deep within Ascendancy military culture: that peacetime development, however extensive, could never fully substitute for the hard lessons only active conflict provided. It was an assumption that had gone unchallenged for 6,000 years of Ascendancy military history. It would not survive the following morning. Instead, the moment the fleet crossed the threshold, every ship's sensors cleared instantly, replaced by something far more alarming than the anomalous distortion they had prepared for. Full, precise tracking data on every single Ascendancy vessel, transmitted from a source their own systems could not immediately identify or locate. A voice reached every ship in the fleet simultaneously, transmitted on a frequency Ascendancy communication systems had never previously encountered, translated instantly and perfectly into flawless Ascendancy dialect. "You have entered human territory with hostile intent," the voice said. "This is your only warning." Fleet Marshal Oss, from his flagship's bridge, ordered the transmission ignored. "Hold formation," he told his fleet. "Proceed toward the system's inner boundary. Let them understand exactly what real strength looks like." The fleet advanced for 11 more minutes without incident, exactly as Oss had predicted, his confidence in the operation's outcome growing with every uneventful moment that passed. Then, without warning, every sensor across the fleet registered the same impossible reading at once. Thousands of vessels, decloaking simultaneously across the entire formation, positioned with a precision that suggested years, if not decades, of planning for this exact scenario. Not 800 ships answering 800 ships, something far larger. Oss's tactical officer reported the numbers with a voice that had begun, audibly, to shake. "Sir, we are reading in excess of 6,000 vessels. Formation is, sir, they are already positioned inside our own formation boundaries. I do not know how they achieved this without any prior detection." Oss stared at the tactical display, watching 6,000 human ships materialize around his fleet of 800, understanding, in the space of a single horrified moment, exactly how badly the Council had misjudged the situation they had sent him to resolve. The voice returned, calm and unhurried, carrying none of the urgency that gripped every officer on the Ascendancy flagship's bridge. 200 years ago, your empire erased us from every record in known space," it said. "You gave us 2 centuries to prepare for exactly this conversation. We would prefer it end without further violence. That choice belongs to you." Oss said nothing for a long moment, his mind racing through tactical options that had, in the span of a few minutes, narrowed from overwhelming advantage to something far closer to hopeless. "Stand down," the voice continued, "and return to Ascendancy space with this message. Humanity does not seek war. We seek only to be left as thoroughly alone as your own empire once believed us to be. That arrangement served us well for 2 centuries. We see no reason it cannot continue, provided your empire does not test it again. Across the 800 surrounded Ascendancy vessels, the mood on every bridge shifted in the silence that followed the transmission. Junior officers who moments earlier had been calculating firing solutions now found themselves staring instead at tactical displays showing a numerical disadvantage so severe that continued engagement no longer registered, on any reasonable analysis, as a viable option. Aboard the cruiser Varen's Pride, a young weapons officer named Tas Korin watched his own targeting system struggle to track even a fraction of the human vessels now surrounding his ship. Each attempt at a firing solution, returning error messages his console had never previously displayed in years of active service. "Sir," he told his commanding officer quietly, "I don't think we could hit even one of them before they finished us. I don't think we ever had a chance to." His commanding officer said nothing, watching the same impossible tactical display with an expression that told Korin everything he needed to know about how the encounter was likely to end. Os weighed his options with the clarity of a commander who understood, beyond any reasonable doubt, that his fleet stood no realistic chance against the force now surrounding it. He gave the order to stand down. The stand-down itself unfolded with a discipline that surprised even the human commanders monitoring the encounter. Ascendancy vessels reversing course in careful, coordinated formation, wrath. Than the chaotic scramble fleet Admiral Chen's staff had modeled as the most likely response. "They are better disciplined than our simulations assumed," Chen noted to his staff as he watched the retreat unfold across his own tactical display. "That is worth remembering. An enemy that retreats with discipline is an enemy capable of returning with discipline as well." He ordered no pursuit, exactly as 2 centuries of careful doctrine dictated. The goal had never been destruction. It had been demonstration, followed immediately by restraint, a combination human strategists had long believed carried far more lasting strategic weight than victory alone. Aboard Os's retreating flagship, the mood among his surviving officers shifted, over the following hours, from raw shock toward something closer to a grim, professional reassessment of everything they had believed about the encounter before it began. "They never fired first," his tactical officer noted quietly, reviewing the engagement's full sensor logs during the fleet's retreat. "They had 6,000 ships positioned inside our own formation, and they never fired first. They wanted us to leave. They did not want to destroy us." Os said little in response, still processing the full weight of an encounter that had, in the span of a single afternoon, upended every assumption his career had been built upon. Chen's fleet held position at the distortion field's edge for a further 3 days after the Ascendancy retreat, maintaining full readiness in case the encounter proved to be merely a preliminary skirmish rather than a conclusive resolution. When no further Ascendancy vessels approached, he ordered a gradual stand-down of his own forces, though the fleet's heightened readiness posture would not fully relax for weeks afterward. Human command remaining cautiously uncertain whether the Ascendancy's retreat represented genuine acceptance or merely a tactical pause before a larger, more determined response. "We have been patient for 200 years, Chen told his officers during the fleet's extended stand-down. "We can afford to remain patient a little longer until we understand exactly how they intend to respond to what just happened." Phase 5 complete. Os's surviving fleet returned to Ascendancy space 4 days later, escorted to the boundary of the distortion field by a small human vessel that departed the moment Ascendancy territory came within sensor range, offering no further communication beyond its initial, unmistakable warning. The report Os delivered to the War Council upon his return triggered a crisis unlike anything the Ascendancy's senior leadership had faced in generations. Grand Archivist Thorne, reviewing the full scope of what Directive Silence had ultimately produced, found herself confronting an uncomfortable truth that no one on the council seemed eager to state aloud. "We did not destroy an enemy 200 years ago," she told the assembled council. "We gave one the single greatest strategic gift any civilization could ask for: 2 centuries of complete privacy, free from any external threat or observation, to build exactly the kind of force we just watched humiliate our own fleet without firing a single shot." Fleet Marshal Oss, still visibly shaken by the encounter, offered little argument against her assessment. "Their numbers alone exceeded our full deployed fleet strength within this sector," he admitted. "And that is only what we observed. We have no confirmed estimate of their total military capability, nor any confidence that what we saw represents anything close to the full extent of it." The council convened an emergency session lasting nearly a full week, debating a question that Sarenth Vale's long-dead confidence had never once anticipated needing to answer. What does an empire do when its own historical erasure of an enemy becomes the single greatest strategic miscalculation in its recorded history? Some council members argued for immediate, overwhelming military mobilization, determined to erase, through force, this time, rather than archival deception, a threat they now understood had grown far beyond anything Directive Silence had ever accounted for. Others, more cautious, pointed to the demonstrated futility of direct confrontation, arguing instead for a policy of careful, permanent avoidance. Fleet Marshal Oss, invited back before the council a second time as the debate over mobilization intensified, offered testimony that ultimately proved decisive in tipping the balance away from renewed military escalation. "I commanded 800 warships into that engagement believing we held every advantage," he told the assembled council. "We were surrounded within minutes by a force we never detected approaching. If they had wished to destroy us, nothing in our formation could have prevented it. I do not believe further mobilization changes that fundamental calculation. It only risks confirming to them had our empire has not learned anything from the encounter." His testimony carried particular weight given his own earlier confidence heading into the operation, several council members later noting that his changed assessment did more to shift the debate than any of Thorne's analytical arguments alone could have achieved. A smaller faction within the council, led by an aging strategist named Councillor Farron Das, continued pressing for a middle path, covert intelligence gathering rather than outright military mobilization, arguing that the Ascendancy could not responsibly commit to permanent avoidance without a far better understanding of humanity's true capabilities and intentions. "We are not asking to invade," Das argued. "We are asking not to remain permanently blind to a civilization capable of surrounding an entire fleet without detection. That is a reasonable caution, not an act of aggression." The council ultimately incorporated a limited version of Das's proposal into its final policy, authorizing narrow, carefully restricted diplomatic intelligence gathering, alongside the broader avoidance doctrine, though human representatives would, in the years that followed, prove considerably more adept at managing the terms of that exchange than the Ascendancy diplomats initially assigned to it ever anticipated. It was Dresh Kale, the mid-level intelligence officer, whose academic curiosity had first uncovered the linguistic anomaly that began the entire crisis, who was eventually called before the council to offer a perspective few of its senior members had considered. "We spent 200 years believing silence meant non-existence," he said. "That assumption cost us any meaningful understanding of what actually happened to this civilization during those 2 centuries. If we repeat that same mistake now, assuming either overwhelming strength or complete harmlessness without genuine understanding, we will misjudge them again, and I do not believe our empire can afford a second miscalculation of this scale." The Council's final decision, reached after a week of contentious debate, formally established what would become known within Ascendancy policy circles as the Sol Boundary Accord, an unofficial but rigorously enforced doctrine prohibiting any further ascendancy military presence within the distortion field humanity had spent 2 centuries perfecting. Trade was permitted, cautiously, entirely on terms humanity itself dictated. Diplomatic contact was established, slowly and carefully, through channels that gave human representatives full control over the pace and scope of any exchange. Military expeditions of any kind were prohibited absolutely, a restriction the Council enforced with a rigor it applied to almost no other policy in ascendancy history. Archivist Prime Vale, long retired but still alive to witness the aftermath of his own finest achievement unraveling into the Ascendancy's most significant strategic humiliation in generations, was asked by a young historian, decades after the fact, whether he regretted the operation that had once been considered his life's greatest success. His answer, recorded in one of the few surviving interviews from his final years, offered little comfort to anyone still grappling with the consequences of his work. "I erased them from every record I could reach," he said. "I never once considered that erasure might be the very thing that let them build, undisturbed, into something my own empire could no longer erase in return." Phase 6 complete. 200 years after Directive Silence began, the region of space it once erased is no longer empty on any star chart, ascendancy or otherwise. It carries a new designation now, adopted quietly across galactic trade registries in the years following the Sol Boundary Accord, not humanity's original coordinates, restored in full, but a careful, deliberate compromise that reflects exactly how much access humanity has chosen to grant the wider galaxy. Human sovereign territory, entry by invitation only. Grand Archivist Thorne, years into her tenure overseeing an Ascendancy archive system fundamentally reshaped by the lessons of Vale's long-ago operation, established a new standing directive that bears her own name in internal Ascendancy records. The Thorne Protocol, as it became known, prohibits any future attempt at large-scale historical erasure of any civilization, regardless of assessed threat level, citing explicitly the unintended consequences of Directive Silence as its foundational justification. "We do not know," the protocol's opening statement reads, "what any erased civilization might become, given time and privacy we can no longer observe or measure. We will not risk creating another Sol." Dr. Amara Voss's historical account of humanity's 2 centuries in hiding, eventually published in full once the relevant details ceased to carry any operational sensitivity, closes with a passage that has since been quoted across a dozen different civilizations' own strategic planning documents. "They tried to erase us from the galaxy's memory," she wrote. "Instead, they gave us the one thing no observed, competing civilization ever truly receives, the freedom to become exactly what we chose to become, without a single outside eye watching to interfere." Ilvana Kaur, the cautious reconnaissance captain whose careful, methodical curiosity first led the Ascendancy to rediscover humanity's hidden presence, remained one of the few Ascendancy officers ever formally permitted to visit human territory in the years following the Accord, invited specifically by human diplomatic representatives who credited her professionalism with preventing a far more catastrophic first encounter. She would later describe the experience, in a rare public address years afterward, as the single most humbling moment of her long career. "I expected to find survivors," she said. "I found an empire that had simply been waiting patiently for the rest of us to notice it again." Dresh Kale, whose obscure academic curiosity about historical linguistics had unraveled 2 centuries of careful ascendancy deception, went on to lead a new division within Ascendancy intelligence, dedicated entirely to identifying and correcting the archive's remaining historical gaps. A task he approached, colleagues noted, with a caution his predecessors had never thought necessary. Every gap in a record, he told his new staff on their first day, is either an accident or it is someone's greatest secret. After Saul, I no longer assume it is the former. Fleet Admiral Idris Chen, the human commander whose decades of preparation shaped the exact response humanity delivered on the day of first rediscovery, remained in active command for another 11 years following the encounter, overseeing the careful, deliberate expansion of human diplomatic contact, with an ascendancy still visibly uncertain how to categorize a civilization it had once confidently declared erased. He never expressed regret for the decades spent preparing for a confrontation that, in the end, required no shots fired at all. We did not build 200 years of readiness hoping to use it, he told a gathering of newly commissioned officers shortly before his retirement. We built it so that, when the moment finally came, we would never have to wonder whether we were ready. Preparedness that goes unused is not preparedness wasted. It is preparedness that worked exactly as intended. The distortion field itself remains active to this day, its boundaries adjusted periodically by human engineers as diplomatic relationships with the wider galaxy gradually expand, granting cautious, incremental access to carefully selected trade partners, while preserving the same fundamental privacy that defined humanity's 2 centuries of hidden development. Younger generations of humans, born long after the Saul boundary accord formalized humanity's careful reemergence into galactic affairs, grow up with a very different relationship to the story than the generation that lived through the erasure itself. For them, Directive Silence is history rather than memory, a foundational chapter in a story their culture tells and retells, of a civilization that turned an enemy's attempt at total erasure into the very foundation of its own quiet, patient strength. Somewhere at the edge of a small, carefully hidden solar system, with 1 sun and 3 worlds, humanity continues building, not in secret any longer, but with the same patience, the same discipline that carried them through 2 centuries of enforced silence. They do not seek to expand. They do not seek to conquer. They seek only what they were once, briefly, denied by an empire that mistook silence for surrender. The right to exist, undisturbed on their own terms. Every empire that has since learned humanity's story tells it a little differently, shaped by whichever detail struck each civilization's own historians as most significant. But every version ends the same way, on every world where the story is still told. They erased us from every star chart in the galaxy. We simply waited until the stars remembered us on their own.